Glad to be with everyone for this continuing Bible study. Let's see if I can share screen here. There we go. All right.
Yeah, there it is.
There we go. It gets on there eventually. All right. So last week we looked at the healing of the official son and the healing of the man at Bethsaida, the pool in Jerusalem where Jesus heals him after 38 years of illness. And then, of course, the big thing that really happens in that beginning of the 5th chapter with that healing with the man at Bethsaida is Jesus is criticized for healing on the Sabbath, which, again, is that kind of thing that they are counting as work, but it's a quirky critique because really any rabbis today, at least in the 21st century, would say healing on the Sabbath actually is the greater good, that you should be healing, and the command to save life and to preserve life is the most important one, and that overrides the commands about the Sabbath. I don't know if that's a new interpretation, but I just know that's the interpretation now, so it would not be an issue. But then as his critics come to him, he responds with a huge discourse. And again, in the Gospel of John, you end up with a lot of these discourses, and they're all pretty difficult to unwrap and to figure out. They're not the easiest things to walk through, but we'll try this morning. We'll see what we can do. So I'm just going to jump right in. Again, right before this, Jesus has healed the man. They've criticized him and said, you shouldn't be healing on the Sabbath. And Jesus' response then is, my Father and I both continue to work in the world, right? It's not that we're done with creation, but there's ongoing creation. And sort of is that his response, which gets the community quite mad at those gathered because now he's equating himself with God, which is the bigger issue for them for sure. In response to all of that, then we get into verse 19, and Jesus said to them, very truly, I tell you, the Son can do nothing on his own, but only what he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, the Son does likewise. The Father loves the Son and shows him all that he himself is doing, and he will show him greater works than these, so that you will be astonished. Indeed, just as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, so also the Son gives life to whomsoever he wishes. Father judges no one, but has given all judgment to the Son, so that all may honor the Son just as they honor the Father. Anyone who does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him. Very truly, I tell you, anyone who hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life. He does not come under judgment, but is passed from death to life. Very truly, I tell you, the hour is coming and is now here, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. For just as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son also to have life in himself. And he has given him authority to execute judgment because he is the Son of God. Do not be astonished at this, for the hour is coming when all who are in their graves will hear his voice and will come out. Those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of condemnation. All right. Got all that? Figured it all out? It's perfect, right? Perfectly understandable. Those are the first 10 verses of a 28-verse discourse. The Gospel of John, we don't get parables. There are no parables in the Gospel of John. Instead, we get these long and completely confusing discourses. Often confusing, almost always confusing discourses. Most scholars agree that the purpose, though, for both the parables and the discourses is the same. That is, they're trying to give the listener something to think about. It's an invitation to think more about what Jesus is saying and what Jesus is asking of us. In a parable, that you tell those stories with sort of an open ending and not a clear message, so that you have to wrestle with what is the meaning. The discourses are written in much the same way. They are convoluted and circular, and they're inviting us to try and figure out a little bit more about who Jesus is in what he's trying to teach us and what he's trying. So now we're going to focus on this particular pericope. All right, so first, pericope is the technical term for a passage of scripture that you're studying. Most people just call it a passage, and it's fine. But if you ever go to seminary or write a paper about it, they call it a pericope, and you can always tell. It was funny when you went to seminary, you always knew when someone was a brand new seminarian because they would not have added pericope as a word to their spelling dictionary, and it would autocorrect to periscope. So people would talk about, we have to focus.
I could see that.
And the periscope and the periscope and the periscope instead of the pericope, the pericope, the pericope. But anyway. So for Thomas Brody, who is a Dominican scholar, he has this idea for these verses that we're really invited to remember the prologue, right? Those first verses, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things came to being through him, right? And not a single thing came to be out. So again, that creation for Brody is right there at the surface because Jesus just said, my Father is still working. Like we invoked that that God rests on the Sabbath, so we are supposed to rest on the Sabbath. That's the great critique of Jesus. Jesus' response is, my Father is still working, and so am I. And you have this idea of ongoing creation, and so we should be thinking back, again, in that sort of idea of God, Father and Son. The Son is the Father, the Logos, the Theos. Those kinds of interconnections are all part of this, at least for Thomas Brody. He understands that creation is deeply connected to relationship. So this is the lens through which he reads these first 10 verses or so. First is the relationship of the Father and the Son, right? That creation all springs from that relationship. The Father is with the Son, and the Son is with the Father, and the Son is the Father. Their relationship brings the very universe, the world, into being. Second, the relationship of the Son and humanity is what animates this conversation. That is, it's the blending of humanity and divinity that creates something new and brings new life. That through Jesus and the Father and the Son, Jesus and the Father, being engaged in this ongoing creation, they are in turn looking to us, to humanity, to be part of that through our belief and through our actions. Here's the real question. Are you buying it? When you read these verses, did you see any of that? This is the hard part of discourse, right? You sort of read what the scholars say, and then you have to go back and say, is that really what I saw or heard in these verses, or is there anything about that at all? So I'll go back just to verse 19, then the very beginning. Jesus said to them, very truly, I tell you, the Son can do nothing on his own. Again, very truly is always a translation, which I find fascinating that we don't, but this is always a traditional translation choice, but Jesus had a very idiosyncratic way of beginning his sayings, and that literally is he's starting and says, Amen, Amen, I tell you. Not very truly, it's Amen, Amen. So there is this sort of, that's the mark of Jesus' sayings often enough, is that Amen, Amen. Truly, very truly, I tell you. So what do we hear in this, if anything?
I have this image in my head of a ball of twine and the way that Jesus and God are connected to each other and all wrapped up in each other.
I like that, yeah. And
that Jesus's authority flows through the Father, that they are all wrapped up together. So one's authority is the other authority.
Mm-hmm. That's absolutely perfect.
That passage about does not come under judgment was almost seemed contradictory to me, because then in the next batch of verses, he's talking about the authority to execute judgment.
Right. Yeah, the thing I have found for a lot of these discourses is if you take one line, like that 24th verse right there. It's on the screen right now, right? Very truly, I tell you, anyone who hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life and does not come under judgment, but is passed from death to life. And you go, all right, I got that, right?
Mhm.
How all these discourses work. You're like, I understand that one. I got this one. And then you go to that next verse on the next page, and suddenly, in that 29th verse, those who have done good come to get resurrection of life. Those who've done evil, the resurrection. Like, wait, there's judgment after all, but it's not that judgment. Is it a different judgment? And it gets confusing because it really does it toggles back and forth constantly, where you sort of, and if you'd only seen that verse, right, you'd say, okay, so the good guys get resurrection, and the bad guys don't get damnation, but they definitely have some condemnation. Whatever resurrection of condemnation is, doesn't show up a lot of times in Scripture, or certainly not in preaching. What does that look like, right? But the hard thing is that's both part of the same speech, and they're only a couple of verses apart, and you go, well, which is it?
Mhm.
How does this work together, or apart, or regardless?
So I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Are these statements attributed to Jesus? You know, there was that study about which ones did he actually say or most likely say. Are these actually attributed to him, or do we think John is writing what Jesus said, or what Jesus was, or who he was?
So there was that, and it was the late 70s, 80s, where they had the Jesus seminar, where they really talked about who was the historical Jesus. They were trying to think about who the historical Jesus was versus the stories that were told maybe embellished who he was or added things that didn't always seem consonant with that, right?
Right.
And so they would literally, if you don't know how that worked, this is literally how it worked. Lots of scholars got together. They did all kinds of research, all kinds of, had all kinds of conversations. But when it came down to it, they would literally vote with marbles. And they had a red marble was they were completely sure that Jesus said it. If it was a pink marble, they were pretty sure Jesus said it, but they weren't positive. If it was a gray marble, they think he probably didn't say it. That was probably more of either the gospel writer or the community that wanted this part of the story added in. And if it was black, then they were pretty positive that this was something the community added, like it was something people said about Jesus more than what Jesus said about himself. I would gamble that almost all of the discourses were black, were gray or black votes, that they thought those were things that Jesus probably said later, or people said about Jesus later more than necessarily Jesus said about himself. But the hard thing is, this is a group of people 1900 years after Jesus declaring what they think Jesus might have said. So there's a lot of question marks around that too, right? They're doing their work and they're doing what they think Jesus might have said, but ultimately we don't know. I mean, all of this is taken on faith, and it's what we have. So, I mean, this is that both and for me, where I would not be at all surprised if John was saying this more than Jesus was. And I also wouldn't be surprised if Jesus said exactly this and John was recording it pretty faithfully, right? Neither would surprise me. But it's part of our text and part of our tradition, so we got to wrestle with it either way. I don't know if that answers your question perfectly, Marcy, but that's sort of how I feel on a lot of these.
Yes, it did. Because I don't have a red letter edition of the Bible where they put it out that way, but.
Well, yeah, I mean, the original red letter Bibles were just King James, and anything Jesus said was in red regardless.
Red. Oh, before the seminar.
Before they did this, they sort of took that as their hallmark when they were doing the Jesus seminar and talking about who is the historical Jesus.
Got it.
Yeah.
And unless John was taking notes when Jesus was alive, his writings were so much later. They were so many years later.
We think,
right?
Yeah, right. We think this was perhaps the last written of the Gospels. We're not positive on that either. I mean,
he had to have some pretty incredible recall to.
Yes, he has some pretty amazing recall if this is exactly it. But this is true for all the Gospels, right? I mean, for Matthew, Mark, John, all of them are written after Jesus, sometime or another. Maybe 10 years, maybe 30 years. And even then, it's written from the perspective of maybe someone who was there, or maybe someone who talked to someone who was there. So you've got a little bit of that sort of either witness bias, that is, that's what that person saw, but that may not be everything that happened. Or you have good old telephone, right? Like, two people told me that this is how the feeding of the 5,000 went, right? But I wasn't actually there. They just told me that's how it works, so I'm going to pass that on to you. Which they might have heard it correctly, or they might have gotten a little part or two different. Or what's pretty clear for all four gospel writers is they also understand what they're writing. They are not writing for historical accuracy. They're writing for belief, to help us in our belief, right? So their goal is not an impartial written statement about the event. This is not a police report, right? This is much more, here's what I believe, as much as it is saying, here's independent and verified fact. That might muddy the water. I don't know if that helps us at all, but that is how, I mean, those are the questions that anyone reading the Gospels has to sort of have in the back of their head as we read it, is to know that, well, I mean, even the Gospel of John, the last verses are saying this is written so that you believe, right? This is all literally recorded so that you could understand who Jesus is. And so it's this attempt to make a theological statement as much as a factual one. Luke claims to have an orderly and recorded account, so he claims to be a little bit more history in his version. But even then, he's also clearly telling the story of Jesus and not just every single thing that happened in the world at the time. So you get a little bit of both. All right. But we'll keep trying to plow through here, right? And see what we can get. So after those initial verses, Jesus continues, I can do nothing on my own. As I hear, I judge. And my judgment is just, because I seek to do not my own will, but the will of him who sent me. If I testify about myself, my testimony is not true. There's another who testifies on my behalf, and I know that his testimony to me is true. You sent messengers to John, and he testified the truth. Not that I accept such human testimony, but I say these things that you may be saved. He was a burning and shining lamp, and you were willing to rejoice for a while in his light. But I have a testimony greater than John's. The works that the Father has given me to complete, the very works that I am doing, testify on my behalf that the Father has. And the Father who sent me has himself testified on my behalf. You have never heard his voice or seen his form, and yet you do not have his word abiding in you, because you do not believe him whom he has sent. You search the scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life, and it is they that testify on my behalf. You refuse to come to me to have life. All right. So this is the second of the three divisions of this passage. Most scholars agree that this was written in three sections, three different areas. And that, not that it was written at three different times. This is all one passage, but they're sort of like this. This has one theme. This has the next thing. This is the next. A great deal of this section is about witness. In those verses 31 to 33, we see Jesus as a witness. Then there's another witness that's not completely clear, but most scholars agree it was God. And then we have the witness of John. Let me go back. That is, if I testify about myself, my testimony is not true. So that is Jesus talking, of course. So if I testify about myself, my testimony is not true. I don't think he's saying that he is not truthful there. I think what he's trying to say is, y'all won't believe me if I tell you about me. Right? If I tell you who I am, you're not going to believe me. And there's another who testifies on my behalf, and I know that his testimony to me is true. And that's the one that typically almost every scholar and theologian agrees that that's Jesus. Jesus talking about God, rather. So that other witness who testifies on his behalf is God, and God's testimony, what God tells Jesus, is true. And then there's the third witness. You sent messengers to John, and he testified to the truth. So John is also telling everyone who Jesus is. So I tell you, but you don't believe me. God tells you, and I believe his testimony to be true. And then John told you. So there's 3 levels of testimony there, right? In that one little part. Of course, the problem is, while John was great and you sort of like John, you didn't believe him. Therefore, you don't believe me, is John's statement. So all speak to who Jesus is, all know what he is doing in those verses, in those witness verses. Believe John, but they're not as sure about the Father, or at least they're not as sure about who the Son is in relation to the Father. That's the great critique. There's a rejection of the teaching. What else do we see of these verses? What do you hear? What do you engage with these particular parts of the passages? And let you look. And the you in this case are those gathered around him, most likely the ones critiquing him, the Jews. And I put this on a slide later. Unfortunately, while I want this to not be a Christian versus Jew critique, it's really this group that does not believe who Jesus is, which, yes, is largely the rank and file Jews at the first century. So it's not the conversation I like to have, but it's the one that I think is being had in the text, right? That Jesus is very clearly saying, you don't believe in me. You don't have his word abiding in you. You search the scriptures. You, the Jews gathered in front of me. You, the people of that era, search the scriptures because you think that you have eternal life. But it's not the one it's not the version we want.
The second half of verse 36 just sort of stood out to me because it's so different. It's that pivot in John where Jesus is saying he wants people to know about the works he's doing, versus in the other gospels where he's saying, don't tell anyone what you've seen.
Yep. All right, well, we'll keep looking. That's fine. Seeing what else we can find in here. So Jesus continues, I do not accept glory from human beings, but I know that you do not have the love of God in you. I have come in my Father's name, and you do not accept me. If another comes in his own name, you will accept him. How can you believe when you accept glory from one another and do not seek the glory that comes from the one who alone is God? Do not think that I will accuse you before the Father. Your accuser is Moses, on whom you have set your hope. If you believed Moses, you would believe me. For he wrote about me. But if you do not believe what he wrote, how will you believe what I say? So, again, the conclusion is clearly a withering indictment of Jews who do not believe in Jesus. Now, while we can easily say that a lot of times in the Gospel of John, when he says the Jews were trying to kill Jesus, that refers much more to the leadership than to the rank and file Jews, that was not really the goal of the average Jew in the first century, was to kill the leadership who understood Jesus as dangerous. But while that was true, and these verses are pretty clear that draw a clear line between those who believe in Jesus, who often enough were also Jewish. But there's a line between those who believe and those who don't. Those very clearly being Jews defined in the text, and most likely are gathered. Again, I don't like these particular verses, but we have to deal with them all as much as the ones we love, maybe even more, because they get caught up with it. So what do we do with these lines, I guess, is one question. Right? What do we do with these? Anyway, I'll back up a little on this part. I do think that we can all agree that part of Jesus's critique is still true today, right? That humanity has a hard time thinking about what God considers important. We're happy to take praise, glory, is the term that is used in this text, but you accept glory from one another. You were happy to get praised on a human level for what humans consider important, right? But you don't seek what's important that comes from God, right? That from God saying, "Oh, you've done it right, and you've done well, my good servant," right? Whether that's financial, whether that we'll talk in certainly in 21st century America about how important it is to have enough money and live in the nice house in the right part of town, while God would say, "I care about the poor and the sick and the hungry and the lost," right? That's clearly what Jesus is critiquing in these particular parts. I don't accept glory from human beings because you guys don't have really great track record of praising the right people. It's more or less Jesus' critique here, right? But I know that you do not have the love of God in you, so I come in my Father's name. You don't accept me. If another comes in his own name, you will accept him, most likely because his values will align with you. We don't accept critique well, I think, is what Jesus is saying in these particular parts of the verses. And just looking at the end of that passage, do not think that I will accuse you before the Father. While Jesus is judge, as we learned earlier in the passage, in this part, Jesus isn't the judge, isn't going to accuse. He's not the prosecutor. It's actually Moses, which this is an interesting turn that either John or Jesus is making. In Judaism, Moses is often considered the advocate, that Moses is the one who will intercede on behalf of Israel, as he does in pretty much all of Exodus and Deuteronomy, right? Anytime Israel messes up, it's usually Moses saying, "Please, God, don't kill them. They're going to do better. They're going to be better this time around." So Moses is the giver of the law, of course, and he's also the interceder. And so the idea is that if you follow the law, then Moses will back you up on Judgment Day. But Jesus is turning that on its head and said, "Hey, if you think I'm going to accuse you, you're getting it all wrong. Moses is the one who's going to accuse you of getting it wrong, because Moses told you who I was in the first place," right? It's definitely turning on its head the expectation of afterlife for many Jews. I don't know if that helps or confuses more, but I do think that's part of what those concluding passages. Well, the problem with discourse, it will make your brain melt. It's all back and forth, and what does this mean, and what are we supposed to hear? And again, scholars will say this is one of the most important discourses in John because it shows this intimate relationship between Father and Son. It's a very clear theological statement, not about the Trinity, but sort of a duality within God. The Trinity doesn't come up until chapter 3. So we got a little while before the Spirit becomes the third part, but it's still considered this incredibly important discourse. But that said, while scholars say it's really important, I have never heard a preacher say, "Boy, as you all remember, here's the passage from John chapter 5. No one goes, "Oh, well, yeah, I definitely." I think because it is complicated, and because it's saying things that take more than a minute to unpack, right? It's easy to say, for God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, and that all believe in him should not perish but have everlasting life, right? John 3:16. That's an easy one to quote. No one is quoting John 5:41 or whatever it is. So it's just a more complex kind of thing. In some ways, it sort of reminds me of that great Mark quote that says the definition of a classic is a book that everyone loves but no one's read, or certainly the critics love but no one's read, which I think sometimes some of these discourses ultimately are like that, right? Like some of the critics and theologians will say, this is brilliant, this is so wonderful, and then most people go, I don't know what is happening. And even when you read some of the scholars and critics, they don't necessarily seem to have their hands all the way around it either. They're pushing and trying to get something, but it's not easy, because it is circular, and it can be contradictory, and it can be obscure. So it's just not. It's just hard. So, anything else we want to talk about the discourse before we can jump ahead to chapter 6 and spend the rest of our time talking about on a little bit more terra firma, more common ground?
So here's an observation that's just now coming to me.
Mm-hmm.
This discourse that Jesus said was in way more detail than he even gave at his own trial. And as a lawyer, whenever I read the trial of Jesus, I'm like, why does he say, that's what you say, instead of giving his responses? And he doesn't even defend himself. But here, he said a lot more than he even said at his own trial.
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, part of it, I think, in the trial, and the trial is very different in the Gospel of John. When we get to that, that's actually a full chapter. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it is just like there's maybe 2 lines, and he says, "Yeah, what you said," and that's about it, right? So John, right, more back and forth, not a lot. There's not a whole lot more lines. I think at that point, at least in part, Jesus sort of understands that he's being railroaded / being scapegoated, right, one way or another. So what's the point of having a big argument when someone's already made up their mind? You're the bad guy. But yeah, it's an interesting contrast to see, like, wow, you just gave us this huge idea of who you are and what you're doing. And in that case, it's just a very passive reflection. All right, well, we'll go to the part I bet you we're all more comfortable with. This is the 5,000 in chapter 6. Which we just had this past Sunday as our gospel reading, the version from Matthew. So this one's a little different, John. I'll point out some of those differences, but it's all right there. So after the discourse, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. All right? So, first question, this is a basic one. What do we know about the Passover? What do y'all know of the Passover feast? What's important? What matters? Or how does it work? Any of those?
The retelling of the story.
Right, the telling of the story. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It recalls God's work in the world, right, to free the Jews and from bondage. The story of Moses and the 10 tribes. It's the 12 tribes, but it's the 10 plagues. There we go. The 10 plagues that free them from Egypt and their flight to freedom. What else? What else about the Passover? And this isn't a trick question. It's a meal, right? Mm-hmm. More akin, so my friends over at Temple Sinai were calling when we COVID had started, and they were like, "Oh my gosh, how are y'all doing Easter? What's happening?" Because I know it's a big deal, and we know enough about each other's traditions and processes to know that that's a big deal. Obviously, for us to say that we can't gather for Easter is monumental for us, right? On their side of things, Passover is not something you go to temple for. You actually go, typically you're in your home and you invite friends and family to come eat, and it's much more like Thanksgiving. And you tell the story of how God has freed the people of Israel, but it's much more about a feast and dining together. It is a meal. That's the whole purpose of the Passover, right? They have bread, they have wine. When they have bread, they have those giant matzah crackers, right, that are much more akin to our little wafers, that unleavened bread. But again, it's this moment to eat with family and recall all God has done and continues to do for Israel. Point of the Passover, specifically the angel of death passing over the Jews and freeing them from their bondage, but also, as any good scholar will tell you, that festival of liberation has to remember that anyone who is being held captive in any situation is not just a Passover for Jews, it should be a Passover for the world. But the real key here is this is the only gospel story that connects the feeding of the 5,000 to the Passover. So John is making a pretty big theological statement, right? If the Passover is a feast of liberation, if the Passover is a feast recalling God's work in the world in the past and in the present, and if it's a meal that's primarily for family, then this statement that John's making is much more about God is continuing to be at work. He's saving and feeding, and all these folks gathered, these 5,000 folks, while they are not physically or genetically related, are in some way part of God's family or part of Jesus's family, right? Very clear recasting of this story in a different way because of that one line, like it was the Passover. So, anything else from that opening part of the verses? It's really just pretty straightforward. He goes up on the mountain. And all the Gospels have the same thing. That is that Jesus seems to be trying to get away from the crowds, or at least trying to create some distance, but they find him anyway. But he goes to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the same thing is true now and then. The other side of the Sea of Galilee is to go from Jewish territory or communities that are largely Jewish into communities that are largely Gentile, right? They're physically going sort of from one side that would be typically, that is modern day Israel, into areas that are, I think it's Jordan, yeah. Right, so in modern Jordan, but in those days it would just be more of the Roman, typically more populated by Gentiles. So in this context, when he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" And this is, chapter 6 is one of the most quintessential Gospel of John lines you will find. He said this to test him, for he himself knew that he was going to do. Again, in the Gospel of John, Jesus is completely God. So there's lots of explanations. If you want to talk about something Jesus didn't say, Marcy, this is definitely one that even the Gospel writer doesn't pretend he says. This is editorial from the Gospel writer to go like, oh, Jesus didn't say he wasn't really worried about where they were going to buy food for people. He knew it. He was going to have this miracle. He just wanted to test Philip. There's sort of like that parenthetical explanation in the middle of it. That is absolutely, even the writer's not even pretending Jesus said this. This is to help us understand that Jesus is completely in charge. You'll see that often in John where he'll ask something and then there's this sort of parenthetical thing that, oh, well, he really wasn't confused or he didn't need to know that. He was just testing someone. Or on the cross when he says, "I am thirsty," and it says he said this to fulfill the scriptures. He wasn't really thirsty. He just said it to fulfill the scripture, right? That he could control everything. He was fine. Anyway, so then Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so also the fish, as much as they wanted. All right, so one quick Greek notation that I think does matter, because this is really how the gospel is written in this one, is a little different. There are 5 barley loaves and 2 tiny fish. If you speak even a little bit of Spanish or know a little bit of Spanish, if you add ito to something, it means it's a diminutive is the term. It means smaller, right? So when someone says, you can say mama, but if you say mamacita, it's like saying little mama or my beloved mama, right? Or it can be literally, oh, she's a little lady, right? It depends on which way you say it, but both can be true. In the Greek, it refers to the fish are tiny fish, like they're these little bitty fish, not too big, I don't know, 5-pound trout or something. These are 2 tiny little fish. So the intention is for understanding that this is a boy's lunch. This is a child's lunch, right? Not something for 5,000 people. So it may be more helpful sometimes to translators to say like, oh, he had 5 rolls and 2 little fish, or even 5 crackers and 2 sardines, right?
Oh,
It should be this kind of thing of like, oh, there is nothing here. There's nothing. This is barely enough to even feed this poor kid, much less 5,000, right?
yeah.
Because we don't translate that particular part perfectly, we miss that sort of those extremes, right? The human offering is very meager at best versus the abundance that Jesus will. So what we can say clearly is that this period was critically important to the first century church, to the early Christians, because it's the only miracle that is found in all 4 Gospels. The only one. There are stories and different things that float between them, but this is literally the only one that shows up in all 4, pretty much the same, apart from just a handful of just differences like John putting it next to the Passover, right? Or Matthew talking about how it was right after the death of John and Jesus is trying to get away and have some time alone. There's just those little bit of differences, but by and large, what's important very clearly in the Christian community is that 5,000 people were fed with a small. What else do y'all see in this first part of the story? The other thing I will say that's just fun to know, in the first century, you did not eat at a big table with chairs the way we do in the 21st century. To dine in the first century, especially the Greco-Roman model, was to have couches and to lie down on your couch, to recline and eat, sort of one propped up on one arm. That was the way free people ate in that era. So while we have that wonderful painting by Leonardo da Vinci of the Last Supper, where all the men are on sort of one side of the table and they're all at a table, that's not at all how it worked. Most likely they were literally lying down. That's actually in the Gospel of John. There's that moment at the Last Supper where the beloved disciple is reclining and puts his head on Jesus's breast, which is a really weird thing to do if you're sitting at a table. Like, how do you put your head on somebody who's next to you sitting at a table? But it's not at all if you're sort of all laid out to just sort of snuggle up next to someone. It's a very different image, right? It's a very different way of doing it. So all that said, when they say there was lots of grass and they sat down, they weren't all literally seated. We should have much more of this idea of that they could recline, that they could sort of lay down on one arm and eat as free people, eat as people who have been loved and redeemed and who are having much more of a feast than just a simple fish and bread kind of meal. And of course, here we should put in the usual joke that it's a good thing Jesus switched to bread and wine, because I don't think people would enjoy a Eucharist of bread and fish quite as much.
Especially sardines.
Especially sardines, yes.
Yeah.
Some years ago, I don't remember if it was in a formation class or what the setting was, but we talked at church about the fact that maybe this wasn't a literal multiplying of the actual food, but it was like that the people present shared with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember being astonished and disappointed, sort of, that the mystery of the story was taken away from that perspective. But the more you think about that people were willing to sit down and share with one another, that if that's what happened, that is as much a miracle.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that is one of those interpretations that is largely a modern one, from what we can tell. That I think some of the critics and really mainly in the 20th century started saying that perhaps this was a teaching that showed that there was enough amongst the crowd for people, if they just shared and didn't hoard, that there'd be enough, right? That would be the miracle is in teaching people not to be selfish in that case, right? Which is a nice interpretation. The hard thing is it's not really in the text, right? I mean, that's truly one of those things, people reading into it more than reading out what it says, which is much more like Jesus took the loaves, blessed them, right, gave thanks for them, and then gave them to people. It was not, and then they're just abundance. And even then, it's not that everyone was fed. It's they ate as much as they wanted, right? Or of this idea, not of, well, they all had a little bit and they shared, and so there was just enough for people. Much more of an image of, well, there was just a little bitty bit. You had just, the crackers and sardines become suddenly enough for 5,000 people to gorge, have a feast, and then there's even left over, right? I mean, a number of them talk about there being 12 baskets left over, and those. I understand that interpretation, and on one level, I like it because I do like the idea that we need to share and we need to find ways to let go of our stuff. But I think sometimes that's like I said, I think that's reading into it more than the text wants us to have.
Mm-hmm. It's certainly not what was written.
No.
Anywhere.
Well, I think they would have, and this is the thing that I think sometimes people do a little bit too much with this, is they'll have this great idea and say, oh, this is how it works. And you go, well, they could have written that down if that was how it worked, right? If they said, and then everyone shared of their own bounty, that they say that. That's not what they're telling us. Instead, it's much more the other end, which is he blessed it, and then suddenly there was this miraculous feeding.
Mm-hmm.
Just to look at the last few verses here, and then we could talk about all of it. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, gather up the fragments left over so that nothing may be lost. So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. And when the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, this is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world. In the last verse, which is probably the most interesting, when Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. So, what do y'all hear in the story in John's telling? Again, that in Matthew, like we had on Sunday, Matthew put the story right after the death of Jesus's cousin John, and he's looking for quiet and alone time, and all these people to sort of show up, and he ends up having to feed them. In the Gospel of John, we have the Passover. We have much more of this image of scarcity, that this child has barely just enough, that then becomes a scene of abundance and of feasting, so much so that people are satisfied, if not stuffed, and there's still plenty of left over. That's just to sort of point some of the differences. What else do we hear in the story?
What's that last sentence about that the people were about to come and take him by force to make him king? I don't ever remember hearing that. That's been lost in the
right
for me.
Yeah, there's an interesting tension that happens in the Gospel of Mark. People want him to be the Messiah, but he's not sure, or it's a secret that Jesus is the Messiah. That's sort of the tension in Mark. The tension in the Gospel of John is that Jesus is absolutely God, and he's constantly pushing back when he does a sign or a miracle, right, from people that are taking it the wrong way. That they want to make him king, right? Or they believe because he heals the man's daughter, right? Or heals the man's son, rather, in the Gospel of John. But they believe because of these miracles, or they want to make him king because of the miracles, but he doesn't want any part of that because the miracles are almost a distraction from the message that he's teaching. But it's a very different. Just to ask some of the other questions, what does John want us to focus on in this story, or what does it mean to you, the feeding of the 5,000?
I mean, I take it as a complete miracle that it actually happened, that it was reported in 4 of the Gospels.
Sure.
That he did feed the 5,000.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think it's a miracle. I do.
Yeah.
I guess the thing that hit me was when you start talking about sardines.
As to how small it was.
Yeah.
I could see creating thousands of sardines versus 5,000 fish. I mean, you know.
Okay.
See, Bill and I have a little background. My dad was an absolute nut about sardines. So.
He wanted no part. He always wanted to share his sardine lunch, but I had no interest in the sardine lunch.
No.
All right. Well, so that's it for this week. Next week, we'll look at the rest of chapter 6, which thankfully does not feature a long discourse. It's more some of the stories that we've heard, walking on water, a variety of other kinds of miraculous moments. But it'll be good. We'll just continue walking through John together, my friends. So we'll see you all next week. Is there anything else we want to chat about or look at?
Thank you so much.
Sure. Great to be with all of you. Hope you have a good day. We'll see you soon.
Okay.
Take care, y'all.
Have a good
Bye.
day.